And we do that through educational programs such as this one, or like our summer strolls that take place now every Sunday through Labor Day of different areas of the city, including our west side. In addition, we provide owners of historic buildings with technical assistance. We advocate for best preservation practices within the city, commenting on exterior changes and new construction, and as well as our restoration projects. And for you, you may not realize that we are responsible for the landscape. We help the city maintain the landscape at our beautiful Spirit of Life and Spencer Trask Memorial at the First in Congress Park. We've helped assist the First Baptist Church. And our current big project is 65 Phyla Street, a long vacant building that we purchased 2 years ago, and we are doing an exterior rehabilitation of that, as well as structural work. And we've concluded our environmental abatement, but we will sell that house to a future owner, and so that they can continue that project and be a good steward for years to come. And any funds that we raise from the sale of that property will go towards a future community preservation project. So I want to thank everybody who made a donation to this program. Your support obviously helps us to provide programs like these throughout the year. I would like to remind you that we are also a membership-based nonprofit. So if you're not already a member, I hope you will consider joining us. Actually, I don't hope you consider it. I hope you do join us, as it helps us to be a stronger voice for preserving our wonderful community. We will include a link for membership in the chat box. So if you'd like to support our mission, please, you can do that. Or if you'd like to provide an additional donation, we of course would welcome that as well. This brings us to some business items before I turn it over to our wonderful presenter. Please be sure to remain muted throughout the program, and we will allow everyone to unmute them when talking later in the program. If you have questions in the meantime, if you could please use the chat feature, which is located in the bottom of your screen, I'd appreciate that. You may need to move your mouse or tap on the screen to see the chat option. Before we get started, one thing I do want to acknowledge is that the Saratoga Springs Preservation Foundation respectfully acknowledges that it is located on the ancestral lands of the Mohican, the Mohawk, and the Abenaki peoples. And we thank them for their enduring stewardship of this land. And we want to acknowledge the Indigenous people. We want to pay respect to those who first lived here and to their communities who followed in caring for this land. We honor the significance of traditional relationships of these sacred lands and waters, and we recognize the ongoing impacts of colonialism and oppression, and we commit to honor truth-telling and Indigenous voices, as well as realize the full history of the many peoples of our where Saratoga Springs is. And so I thought it was important that we share that statement, and this is something that we all need to be reminded of. Now I want to introduce Dr. Myra Armstead. She is a Lyford, Patterson, Edwards, and Helen Gray Edwards Professor of Historical Studies at Bard College, where she served both on the steering committee of the Environmental and Urban Studies program, as well as the which is EUS affiliate, and is a EUS affiliate faculty member, trained as an Americanist who explores the complexity of urban and rural nexus. She has taught courses on urban disasters, the suburban ideal, urban history, African Americans and cities, and the history of horticulture as practice, social lens, and cultural idea in the United States. So she's also an author of a book called Lord, Please Don't Take Me, in August, of African Americans in Newport and Saratoga Springs, 1870 to 1930. So with that, we're gonna have a conversation about a really important topic in our community. And before, I sort of have several questions and to help sort of guide the discussion with Myra, and then we'll open up to other people to perhaps provide comments and discussion. So I had to ask about Myra's background and how she came to study Saratoga Springs. And so I'm gonna ask, how did you become involved with the research about the Black community of Saratoga Springs? Could you tell us a bit more about your background and how you arrived at this interesting topic?
Certainly. The short answer is that there was an autobiographical route to that. Amazingly, I didn't realize that until I was deep into the research and almost done with it. I grew up in the Catskills, the lower Catskills, the area that was known as the Borscht Belt. During its heyday, there were very few Black people there, but we had a sense of community as well as connection to the larger population. In fact, during the years that I was there, it was a very progressive community. But being a curious child, maybe someone who was destined to become an academic, I was always curious, and this curiosity grew as I entered high school about the connection between cities and places like the little town that I grew up in. I didn't know that there was an academic way to study that until after I finished my master's. I learned that there was a field that was very well staffed at the University of Chicago, where I was living. At the time, I had just finished my master's in international relations, of all things. It was called Urban History, and Chicago had a long history of actually pioneering urban sociology. So I decided, after a kind of serendipitous period of time working for the Urban League, to go back and get my dissertation. I had met a lot of people at Chicago who were in history and were doing urban history. So I was just interested in that whole big question. What are urban places? How did that process happen? How do people who were in history agricultural at first decide to move into cities? Those big questions. And as I started taking courses in that, and particularly in American urban history, there was a lecture or two that was given on specialized cities, one type of which was the resort town. There was no literature on it, and I was curious about it because I had grown up in that kind of area. I was encouraged to look into it for dissertation. Then there was another area that I learned about in studying urban history, American urban history, and that was northern cities and towns that had Black populations before the Great Migration. So after reading a couple of those books, I went to my dissertation advisor, and she said, yeah, you could do something on that too. And as things came together, I sort of collapsed the two topics in looking at the history of Blacks in two resort towns. And so if you've read the book, you see that I kind of do a quick overview of the rise of resort towns, what they were, what kind of animal they were. Believe it or not, there was no literature on that at the time. And then I decided to study Saratoga and Newport, because since they were so popular in their heydays, there was a relative, I don't know, I wouldn't say a lot of literature, but compared to other resort towns, there was more. And so I thought, okay, I'm researching something that is pretty original, and so original that people shake their heads when I tell them about it. They don't even think I can study it. So, so I chose two, and Saratoga was one of them. I can't hear you. You're muted.
I muted myself. Ah, the dreads of Zoom and coordinating that. Thank you so much, Myra, for sharing how you arrived at researching Saratoga. So I know that this is a big topic, and of course, can't really cover it. Every question that I'm going to ask is it could be its own presentation in of itself. But just for some background, like when and how is the Black community established in Saratoga Springs? My understanding is that we had a Black population here before the Civil War. So is that true? And when did we see increases, and sort of what impacted that?
Well, we did have a Black population in Saratoga before the Civil War. And that followed the incorporation of Saratoga as a city, which was going to focus on resort building, the discovery of the springs and the need for service workers. So we have evidence of that. A couple of pieces that some of you may be familiar with, maybe not, is a hand-drawn map that is at the in the Saratoga room, I think it's called, of the library there that I discovered many decades ago now when I was doing the research. Hand-drawn map that shows just a skeleton of a town. All you have is Broadway as a north-south axis, and then you have a couple of streets to the east and west. And at the bottom, in other words, in the southwest corner going west, is Congress Street. And it's labeled a few houses of colored people. And so part of what I did was sort of explain that location. They were working for the hotels that were starting to go up. So that was the beginning of the Black population. And then as the big hotels in the 1850s and 60s, particularly after the rise of the gambling and the track, that population increased because they became the main waiting staff at the major hotels. And that persisted amazingly through the demise of those hotels. In that, Saratoga Springs is an outlier because whereas in many places that were resorts or not resorts even, in major cities where Blacks were waiters as a kind of, I would say, a retention of the kinds of roles that they held as domestic workers during slavery, during the period of enslavement. These were replaced later in the 19th century as new immigrants came and took jobs that typically were held by Blacks. We see that for sure in jockeying, because Blacks were jockeys, and they were replaced in the late 19th century by other immigrant groups coming in. And the increasing racialization of racial segmentation of certain fields. Barbering was another. So they sort of lose ground. All of these were things that were associated with enslavement. You would have Blacks taking care of horses. You would have Blacks taking care of white people's hair. But with immigration, you have competition. And with the rise of I would say hardening racialization in this country, particularly following the end of the Civil War, these jobs were just taken over. So it's amazing that the major hotels continue to prefer Blacks as waiters. That's absolutely amazing. And that had a lot to do with whoever was the maitre d', whoever the owners decided to keep as a maitre d', made the big decisions about who was going to be hired. And in the case of the big hotels, it was the decision was to retain Blacks. Some of these were, a lot of them, in fact, were students at what we now call the historically Black colleges and universities. And there was almost a system whereby they would go in the summer to a spot in New York City and be interviewed for summer jobs as waiters, and Saratoga was on the receiving end. Booker T. Washington also targeted Saratoga for fundraising for Tuskegee. So there was, and then there was a kind of Southern clientele that Saratoga Springs had among the tourists for a long time. So for all of these reasons, Blacks were able to hold on to the waiting posts. And what would happen would be that some of those waiters would not go back to the South, they'd stay. The Great Migration just increased that as Blacks were just moving generally to the North, and some preferred to live in more exurban rural areas than in the major places of Black settlement that were forming. The ghettos were forming in the early 20th century. So that's sort of an overview.
Wow. That's really interesting, and thank you for sharing. I had no idea that we were an outlier in that respect. Mm-hmm. We know we mentioned that the Black community did settle on Congress Street. That was became I would say their main street in some ways. And were there other areas in the city where the Black community had a stronger presence, if you will?
I studied for my book the period from 1870 to 1930, which I call the heyday of both of those resort towns. So during that period, there were two areas of Black settlement. The area that was more populous than the other one by far was that West Side area. That's where the bulk of the Black community lived. There were a couple of Black churches that were formed in the late 19th, early 20th century as a result of the Great Migration. Mount Olivet Baptist Church was one. So that side, but there were Black people who wanted to be away from even that area. They wanted less congested living, to replicate more of a rural lifestyle. They didn't want to rent, they wanted to own. So they started to move in the early 20th century to the area that is on the southeastern fringe of the city. At that time, it was called Bryantville. So that area was relatively undeveloped. It was a poor to working class area. The city services did not extend there, the telephone lines, the rail lines, even though that part of the city was in the corporation limits. They had their own teachers, their own school system. I interviewed people who talked about that. It was a mixed community, Black and white. Just a few Black families, Bryantville. That area, of course, is not the same at all. We can talk about that later. But, that was a kind of forgotten outpost of an area. Even when I did my interviews when did I do them? In the mid 80s to late 80s, that area was relatively undeveloped. Of course, it had utilities, but it was relatively undeveloped. So those were the two main nodes, the West Side for sure, and then a few scattered Black families on the southeast end. Now, Dyer Phelps Church, which was on Maple Street, sort of behind where the convention center is now on that hill, that was just a kind of anomaly. It was definitely important to the Black community. It was a major social institution. It had been supported even by philanthropists, white philanthropists, and that is not an area of settlement, but it's something that must be brought into the conversation when you talk about displacement of the Black community. So residentially, those two nodes, and then I think importantly, that church.
Thank you. I think most of us know it as Brantville versus Bryantville, the southeast side. Carol Daggs, a local resident who grew up there, has published a book called Brantville, Saratoga Soul, Brantville Blues. And so for anybody who is interested, you might want to check out that to learn a little bit more about that area. So I think the Black community all across the country has sadly been had systemic racism in their policies, whether it be the federal highway administration policy that was also, to quote, remove blight, redlining, where they just weren't, the banks wouldn't allow any lending into people of color, any color in certain areas of our whole city. And so, and then you have urban renewal, and maybe Saratoga was like many cities across the country that use this money, quote, to remove blight for economic development. However, it's certainly based on just I recently attended the Brown Bag Lunch, Erasing Spaces and Faces, and just the stats of the Black ownership in what was then called Project One, which for those of you in Saratoga, that is Congress Street, and leading up to Grand Avenue, and you can still see, quote, the results of urban renewal in that area, which is largely parking lots, which was once a very vibrant part of the city. And so maybe you could talk a little bit more about urban renewal, Myra, and your thoughts on the areas and how it impacted Saratoga.
Yeah, my research on Saratoga Springs was in two parts. So there was the dissertation in the book, which went to 1930. That sparked some local interest by local historians. There were a couple of exhibits, a WMHT special. And so I was called back to look at the period after 1930. At that time, I think it was maybe 2000. And that's what took me into urban renewal and the records on urban renewal. And it was really amazing to see the disappearance of the community that I had studied in my first book. And those records helped me understand what I saw when I was doing my research in the 80s, which was, as you explained it, just a bunch of parking lots, it was just a shell, even that of what it had been. Now, at present, that whole area has been redone again, so that there are retail establishments there, where before there was nothing. There was like a Woolworths, a very sad sort of forgotten, sort of shabby looking kind of strip mall esque place. So urban renewal did that, but it also removed the heart of the community in terms of social institutions, churches. They were relocated to, using eminent domain, to that southeastern part of the city. And sadly, I would think it would interest preservationists. the buildings that were constructed, because, you know, the congregations were never large, were very modest, to put it mildly. Whereas Dyer Phelps was a beautiful edifice in its way, a brick-like exterior. I'm not sure if it was actually brick, but a much more substantial, churchy looking place, as opposed to, you know, the kind of I don't know, sort of prefab modular looking establishment that they were left with. So you know, it just sort of eviscerated the life of that street. Now, that street also had on it restaurants and nightclubs. The nightclubs kind of went the way of the hotels. They were dying anyway. But the restaurant that I remember having to relocate was Hattie's. Hattie was alive when I did my research, and she talked about how she happened to open up on Congress Street. Congress Street was the logical place for her to open up. She said that the workers, particularly those at the track, would come in late at night, and she'd have all this hot chicken, you know, ready for them. And she was able to find the place that is over on, was it Violet Street? I can't remember.
Violet Street. Yep, Violet Street.
Yeah, and she had a long story about that. She, you know, my sense was that, you know, unlike the planning, the relocation planning for the street as a whole, which, you know, sort of lifted whole pockets and, you know, or, you know, social institutions and remove them, she had to negotiate on her own to get a place. And so she had a very interesting story that is captured in the WMHT video, or the documentary that they did, in which she talks about her friendship with the son of the mayor, I think, you know, and you know, how she leveraged that in a very, oh, I don't know, in a very individualistic way. Like I used to, you know, give you free biscuits. So yeah, the effect was really devastating. You know, the combination of the decline of the resort industry in general, and the kinds of jobs that Blacks had in those industries, plus the removal of, you know, their main edifices, really made a difference, a negative difference in the vitality of the Black community.
Yeah, some of the notes that I took from the recent Erasing Spaces and Faces brown bag lunch at Saratoga Springs Public Library. It was interesting to know that at one point the Black community was roughly at 6.5% of our population, but then with Urban Renewal, it was less, like 3.5% or 3%, you know, because they were given only so much money to relocate. But if they didn't have their jobs, they weren't willing to, they didn't choose to stay in Saratoga. If you don't have the jobs and you don't have the community, why would you stay? And deservedly so. 53% of the houses in Project One were owned, I believe, by Black owners. And so just to think about what Project One did to that base of population it's just hard to imagine as somebody who's seen pictures of that street and who now walks down Congress Street and sort of feels like it's just a void in the landscape. It's sort of disappointing to see that that's not the lively neighborhood that it once was. So, I think it's always it's a tough topic. How do the stories of displaced communities figure into a mission like an organization like mine? Often traditional preservation thinks of only the buildings, but I think our mission in it has not just architecture, but it has cultural land in our mission statement, and I guess that goes to why we've been exploring this topic and why I hope we continue to. So what are your thoughts on that,
Well, I'll just
Myra?
reiterate what you just stated. First of all, preservation projects and societies uh, um, need to move, if they haven't moved, from their traditional self-understanding, which is to focus on buildings and architecture that is considered, art historical worthy or classical, or, of a particular school, and to include what Dolores Hayden called vernacular architecture. So to the extent that there are remaining buildings like that in Saratoga Springs, and I don't think there are, it's important to move towards widening the understanding of what preservation is. But absent the buildings, I think preservation societies which are by definition physically oriented or materially oriented, can play a very key role in advocating for memorials, for markers, for uses of public spaces that recall that history in some way. And that conversation can be very lively. So, I was thinking about this for tonight, but also in other contexts. When we think of Saratoga Springs, one of the things that happened was by the mid 20th century, by 1960, Saratoga was sort of in search of a mission, an economic raison d'etre. And part of what happened was to focus on bringing culture from New York City. So, so you have the ballet, you have these spaces, you have the jazz festival, where people can enjoy entertainment and art and, dance and concerts. Congress Street was notorious for, that kind of entertainment. Might it be possible to think of creating, public squares that do not now exist for performances? I mean, there's Congress Park. I'm not sure what happens there, but are there spaces that could be opened up for particularly, I would say, local indigenous performers to come? I think of the fact that historically the two hotels, I think both of the hotels, no, maybe it was the United States, I can't remember which, but one of the big hotels regularly hosted Frank Johnson, who was a Black composer from Philadelphia in the years before the Civil War. He had a real reputation, and there have been exhibits and biographical works done on him, but he regularly performed in Saratoga. I could imagine concerts that featured his work, particularly since as an African American, he could perform, but Blacks could not come into the hotel to see him. So, that kind of thing, or just preservation spaces, I mean, markers, like, Pomeroy markers, that kind of thing. So that's sort of where I would start in terms of preservation. Maybe even working, well, that's where I would start.
I think that the challenge that an organization such as mine that has a small staff and is who can speak for this history and doing so in a sensitive way that I don't think any of us want to take that history. So it's always so who can speak to that history and to help tell those stories?
Well, I would say you want to engage the Senate communities. Unfortunately, you don't have a lot of persisters for the very economic reasons that we have discussed, but the Daggs family has persisted. I remember interviewing Margaret Daggs, whose memory went back to the early 20th century, and her father, if not her grandfather, had come from Madagascar to Saratoga Springs. So, and you only have like one or two families, but they become the trove, the essential trove, and I think I remember Carol was in high school when I started and I interviewed her. So it's just wonderful hearing that she's carrying the torch. But I think involving those communities or representatives from that community, those communities in any conversation moving forward is absolutely critical. And then, experts, people who are doing contemporary research on, this history, I think would be key as well. To go back to the other question, one of the things that happened and I say Bryantville because it might have been pronounced Mantville, but when I was doing the research, that's the way it was referred to in all the sources that I saw.
Interesting.
One of the things that the Daggs were known for was that their chickens and the not farm, but the garden that they had. I don't know what you would call it. It wasn't a huge spread, but they were quite entrepreneurial about that, supplying the racetrack restaurant on a regular basis with fresh eggs. And Margaret Daggs talked about it, how many chickens they would have to kill, 100. I mean, it was pretty big. They had a lot of chickens. And then I interviewed I think her nephew. It's in that documentary, and he had retired from New York City and had built a house for his retirement out there, and had a garden. And he talked very fondly about how good it felt to continue the family tradition, knowing that his forebears had farmed out there, and that he had a garden, a pretty healthy one. And the camera followed him putting in some plants. But we talk about community gardens. There could be some kind of community garden that could be built as a memorial as well to that tradition, preserving that tradition, and involving the family members. When I was talking about Indigenous performers, Carol's training is in jazz. She's a wonderful pianist, and her uncle also was a musician. And Margaret Daggs, who I interviewed, brought down a family mandolin. And that mandolin, she said, they had out there in Bryantville their own entertainment. And she said on winter days, they'd all get together and they'd have, and she said it was like a hoedown. And I said, well, really? What kind of music? And she went upstairs and she got the mandolin. she called it country music. I don't know that it was what we would consider country music, but, just sort of recalling that tradition. Carol's brother was a musician as well. And the family did, whenever it got together, sort of reenact all of that. And that was captured in the documentary as well. So, connecting that, involving the descendant communities in public spaces, entertainment spaces, I think is another preservation opportunity.
Somebody do you know the exact name of the WMHT documentary? One of our people watching, and I think we all are curious about it. Maybe we'll figure out if maybe there's a way that
hard to get. It's not hard to get. It was done about 1992. And I think about 5 years ago, I contacted the station. And the producer at the time was someone named Stephen Dunn, D-U-N-N. You might want to mention that. And I told them it was called something very straightforward, like Blacks in Saratoga. And they said they'd look. And lo and behold, they found it. So it's not that hard to find. I think I have it somewhere. So I think that would be important. There's so many little parts of this history that would be so much fun to think about remembering. So, for example, the story of the potato chip, and George Crumb and working out at the lake house. Well, that's not Saratoga Springs per se, but, we still have Hattie's and, maybe partnering with area, I don't know. I haven't formed this. This is just coming out, as I'm speaking, but, some kind of, working with other community groups to sort of preserve the culinary innovation and, restaurants, that kind of thing. But I've veered away from the idea of, actually the land and the environment and, housing and social institutions that are housed in buildings. And I think that's really important. Solomon Northup, of course. Now that could be commemorated with some kind of sculpture. There's a woman who, her name is Vinnie Bagwell, and she has quite a reputation working in the lower Hudson Valley, particularly Westchester, helping local Black historical societies to erect commemorative sculptures. She's a sculptress herself. So she has done some really beautiful work. And I know in Poughkeepsie now there is a reorganized local Black Historical Society that is trying to get some kind of physical commemoration along the waterfront of the enslaved community that was present. So that's another avenue as well, sculpture to commemorate the waiters. The waiters were there, and working with the lodges. I don't know if there are still Black fraternal lodges there.
Somebody just asked, Frederick Allen Lodge still does exist, and somebody was asking about that, and that originally was located on Congress Street and was relocated, I believe, as part of Urban Renewal, and moved into their building on Beekman Street. So yes, they had some activities related to Juneteenth this weekend and today. So we are really fortunate that they still do exist, and
storyboards
and are very active.
Yeah, having external sustainable protected storyboards, you know, if that building were interested in having one. The Bolster collection may have photographs of the original building. Um, um, there are parks, for example, I have seen in other work that I've done, say in the South, in southern cities, that were segregated and that are now integrated. And if you walk through certain sections there, it's the storyboards that have been erected um, are just such an enhancement of the landscape. It's sort of acknowledging what this piece of property, how that piece of property was used in the past. You know, you have these storyboards are, you know, permanent installations that stay outside, and anytime anybody, you know, uses that area or passes by that area, they can see it. I've helped erect those for buildings on my own campus that were um, somehow or another connected with enslavement practices. So, you know, those are other ways of preserving this history.
Well, we're really lucky. In the last several years, there has been a group through that Create Communities. They've established erasing spaces and faces and the legacy of urban renewal in Saratoga Springs. They have a website, and they have art projects, and I think we hope to partner with them, and then near future on a walking tour that we do a walking tour of the West Side, but I think we're potentially going to do a different walking tour. And I have to say, I was fortunate enough to be in Providence, Rhode Island, for a historic trades summit, and one of the tours that was offered was a tour of urban renewal in Providence, and we had the amazing speaker Keith Stokes, and you're thinking, well, what's a tour of urban renewal? And it was empowering to see, you know, to hear him talk about the communities that had existed in these spaces, but then seeing what had happened as a result of the policy that had been adopted that has marginalized so many communities, including immigrant communities and new immigrant communities that are coming to Providence. So I think we're hoping to partner with them and do that. I think maybe we could ask if people have some questions or want to make comments or just share their thoughts. I'd welcome people to do that, but maybe they would do so by raising their hand, and maybe Nicole then could help with that.
Absolutely. So there is a feature in the reactions where you can raise your hand, or if you just want to turn on your camera and raise your hand, you can do that as well.
It would be lovely to see some of these faces, I must say.
Oh, there they are. They're popping up.
Thank you.
I like it. It's always a little more fun to talk when you see faces versus a screen full of names, I must say.
Yeah, I was traumatized by Zoom during the pandemic.
I think we all were.
You know, walking through these blank squares.
Not knowing if it's resonating with anyone or not.
Exactly. Thank you so much.
Some of us were eating our supper, I'm afraid.
I know that. I don't mind.
I do. I don't like
it. Does anybody have a question?
I do.
Oh, Gina, please go ahead.
Yes. This presentation is fabulous. Thank you so much. Where do you think is the best way to do research on, like, I would love to know what restaurants and businesses were on the West Side before urban renewal.
Easy. City directories. And the library has them. And so they predated telephone books. And so you can literally reconstruct, you could take you know, a base map of Saratoga, the street, what it looked like, and just recreate from year to year what businesses were where on what side of the street. So you could do it that way. For earlier in the 19th century, there were wonderful insurance maps that were done.
Sanborn maps.
Yes, I was going to say Sampson, and you know, the
Sanborn.
yeah, the Sanborn maps are really
Okay.
good because they'll let you know even what the building is made of, because they were, you know, to help insurers know what was a risky place to insure. You know, they were afraid of fires. So, you know if they're made of brick or if they're made of wood. And, you know, they have the outline sketched. So you can do that. And that, along with the bolster collection, I think really helps create a lively picture of what that street looked like. And certainly it was alive in my head. Unfortunately, at that time, you know, as a student of the University of Chicago, and then also as someone seeking to get tenure, and you know, somebody who was being held to these academic standards, I had to be so clinical. If I were writing that today, it would be so different. I would have been able to translate what I saw in my head from those directories and the maps.
I would like to say something quickly to Myra in particular. It's wonderful, fabulous presentation, but I think it's time for another WMHT special. There are so many people my age that have memories of being at the Golden Grill, being at Hattie's when it was in another place. And I think it would be wonderful to get together somehow with Samantha, who's very organized, and Myra, and speak with the families of the Walzacks and the Ellises and the Daggs and share memories, because that's what people really need to preserve. I think that's very important to us in Saratoga. It's been an instrumental part of our development. Thank you, Myra.
Oh, thank you.
Carol. Carol, I mean, could you share maybe a memory or two of Golden Grill or or Hattie's, just maybe to give a...
It was just such an unbelievably fun place. And it was the first time we were probably in our early 20s. And there were so many Black and white people got together and just had a great time together, dancing and singing and, you know, live bands. And this is what we need to remember about Saratoga, that we're a wonderful community of diverse populations. And I think we really have to preserve that in history.
Thank you, Carol.
Talked about the bands, the big bands that would come through, even through the 60s.
I saw somebody else who had their hand up. Did they put their hand down? Was it Eden?
Yes. Thank you so much for this. It's been really wonderful. I've actually, Samantha and Nicole, I talked to you about this a long time ago, but in the Arts District on Beekman, we've been working on a project with Skidmore for many years, that we will hope to incorporate some of Julie's work on the Urban Renewal of doing an actual walking tour of the immigrant communities and the Black community on Congress Street. And some of these ideas are wonderful that I'm going to share with our Skidmore counterparts. But there is an oral history project that the Skidmore kids have been digitizing for the last couple of years. And there are a lot of there are people who are recorded from the 1980s remembering their childhood on Congress Street. So we have access to some of that. It's really, it's fantastic, but it's going slowly because it's being done according to Library of Congress standards. So it's just taking a very long time to do it, but I would love to talk to the Preservation Society about it. Anybody else who'd be interested. And we do have, we've been trying to collect lots of photographs and all sorts of things, which we've gotten a lot from Joy, who is the great granddaughter of Frederick Allen.
Yes, and Joy was hoping to join us today, but
They've got an
unfortunately,
event tonight,
No, she was, she had something, come
Oh.
up, but at the very last minute, and,
Oh.
so I plan to talk to Joy, and like I said, the Erasing Spaces and Faces, they actually have, on their website, they highlighted a couple of different buildings, and one of the things that they said has been a little bit, challenging, is that there weren't a lot of pictures of the exterior. There's exterior pictures of these buildings, but they were largely recorded for, quote, the blight, or it was like after they had some people had been relocated, so the buildings don't show the liveliness of the street. It just sort of has these boarded up sort of, like, I'm sure to probably perpetuate the, quote, we need to do this for blight. So that's unfortunate, but I know that that's one of the art projects that one of the artists is doing through this, is to sort of highlight those spaces. She's got like a miniature streetscape, and she's making it, with the lights on and like people, and sort of trying to bring back that, what you guys all recall is this active and engaged, lively area, instead of what these black and white photos sort of represent. Does anybody else have a question or a thought or an addition, or?
I have one more, sorry. When she
Sure,
was talking
go.
about the music squares,
Mhm.
for musicians, it just made me think of like New Orleans and Savannah, and how beautiful and exciting it is when you're visiting those cities and you see these musicians playing in these really nice little squares. I would love to see something like that happen in Saratoga, not just on Broadway, somewhere on the west side. And it's so vibrant, and it would be such a wonderful addition. Do you think there's any chance something like that could happen?
Anything is possible. Anything is possible. I don't think anybody should think small, I guess, is maybe what we are gonna take away from this. Myra, what was the name of the composer from Philadelphia that you mentioned earlier? Somebody was asking for the name.
Frank Johnson.
Frank Johnson?
Yeah, Frank. Sometimes referred to as Francis. You can actually probably Google him at this point, and find, I think, copies of some of his music. I don't know if articles have been digitized, articles about him, but it's not that hard now to get information on him. When I started, it was like, going into the wilderness, but there were other things too, that some of you have brought up that I did, oh my goodness, there were so many thoughts. WMHT, that came about because there was a producer that was interested, because the Saratoga Springs Historical Society did an exhibit, I think around the same time, on Blacks in Saratoga, and the producer came in and said, oh, this is a great idea for a show. So you'd have to convince the team at WMHT that this is worthwhile doing, but it definitely is. About the Saratoga project, this is an idea that you might have already considered. I don't know, but the walking tour, you can have like a mobile app that sort of recalls the sort of key places and spaces, and a person can do a self-guided tour using this mobile app. So,
Yes.
I've seen places that do that. I don't know, what kind of money is involved in this project. And I'm also motivated to pull out the interviews that I did and hand transcribed, if I can find them, for the original dissertation, and then the additional ones I did for the book, and then the ones I did for the study ending in 2000, because some of those people, they had one foot in the grave when I interviewed them, so they're long gone, but they're important in recalling that. And then just one last thing about the liveliness of Congress Street. The Black newspapers sometimes had a correspondent in Saratoga, sort of breaking news, this band is playing, or, sort of scuttlebutt news, sort of like the society news that the old newspapers had. Well, when before the 60s, when Black newspapers flourished because mainstream newspapers didn't cover Black life, Saratoga, I was so surprised to see, a regular column on Saratoga Springs in the summer, in Washington, D.C., which was where the Black middle class and upper middle class lived. So there were Black tourists that went to Saratoga Springs as well. And that's another whole thing, like the location of all of those boarding houses for the Black tourists.
The green books.
And sort of including that in the walking tour as well.
I know in the chat there's been some conversation about the Muzan House, which of course also is really a special place. And I think Barb, you could maybe, it looks like you're being asked to touch on that, but I do want to just say some time ago now I say it's some time ago, it's probably been 10 years, just been here that long, that there was conversation about, could the Muzan House be added to the Broadway Historic District? And we reached out to the state Historic Preservation Office at the time, and they were like, there's no context, no, like it's not eligible to be included. And I think now it would be worth pursuing whether or not it could be individually recognized as an outlier of somebody who stood up against urban renewal and laid their claim and didn't give up their property. But Barb, what are you gonna share?
Well, I don't have that much more. I mean, I knew Mia and her husband Rocco. Well, I'm not sure they were married, but anyway, and what I did hear from them was that their family did indeed stand up to the urban renewal. But what I never did understand was whether that house was sort of uniquely theirs and it was not a part of a larger community that was urban renewal. I mean, I think that space behind the city center was a part of urban renewal too, but I don't actually know that.
Yes, I mean that whole area.
And I would think, if you can still locate Mia's daughter, she would have maybe some family stories about that.
Yes, good point. Does anybody else have any comments, thoughts, memories that they want to share for tonight? If not, there's a couple takeaways. Be sure to obviously Eden Compton was talking about their work with Skidmore, which of course is really interesting, and I'm excited to know that there are these archives of oral histories that are being done and will be held in perpetuity, which I think is really important. Again, the erasing spaces and faces, this is something that they have been working on. Oh, we have a question, so we're not done yet. Have been working on this for several years, and and they have some art, and they have some, like I said, check out their website where it highlights certain buildings and different things, and they have regular events. So be sure to take note of that. The foundation, since before I started, has been doing a West Side walking tour, and we try to share a little bit of everybody's history on the West Side, the Italians, the Irish, as well as now I really want to include just a bit more about urban renewal and than we have in the past in the Black community. So we're making some changes to that walking tour, and that's going to be on July 9th. And so I would encourage you to mark your calendar for that. But in addition, like I said, we're hoping to partner on a program in the fall, and we'll keep you posted, of course. And I think, wait, it was Terry who had a question. Do you want to ask your question, Terry?
Yes, I unmuted myself. I'm not that good on Zoom, so I'm not quite sure how to get my video going here, but you bear with me. My question, is that okay?
Sure, go for it.
Okay, my name is Terry Jackson. I was there up in Saratoga about 2 weeks ago, and Lori Wees was nice enough to meet me at the Saratoga room in the library. And you know, she showed me some of the maps, the old maps there. Then she took me on a little tour around Saratoga, and she showed me one of the houses one of my relatives, one of my ancestors lived in. His name was William T. Lattimore.
Oh my.
Yes, Miss Armstead. We spoke before, but I think it might have been on email, and I do have copies of your book, excuse me. What was it? Lord, please don't take me in August, right? And I read it pretty thoroughly. I'm still looking through it, reading it, and trying to see how it relates to my family that lived in Saratoga and Moreau. And you know, we've been doing a lot of family history. So it was really nice of Lori take me around, take me to the house of William T, take me to the Green Ridge Cemetery, where I got to see, you know, some of the monuments there for the family. And what I really found was really interesting, what I just learned when I'm online with you and on Zoom call, and I did a little search of one of the properties that Hardaway A. Whalen, I think you might be familiar with that name. Whalen, he was the head waiter at the Warden Hotel there for like 50-something years in Saratoga Springs. I did a little search on one of his properties, 48 Congress Street, because it used to be I guess it was a hotel, Whalen Hotel. I don't know if it was a real hotel or not, but it is listed under his properties along with Jesse Lattimore, Jesse Martin Lattimore, Whalen, as one of their properties. And it's really interesting that it was right across the street from where I was staying there 2 weeks ago. I was staying at the Embassy Suites Hotel, and I believe it's 68, and this property was 48, which is now, I guess, part of where CBS is located. So I just found it out. It's like just really, really amazing. But my question is, before I forget it, Brantville. Is there any way I can go online and see what area of Saratoga Springs that encompasses?
Well, there was a map that I think I had drawn in that book, which is it just kind of lets you know generally where it was. But this line of research that you're referring to would be really, really fruitful. I got really tired when I was doing the tax records. You know, I spent a lot of time on the census records. You'd have to imagine that this is long before digitization. So you would just have to sit there and, you know, crank out the microfilm of the original manuscript, you know, sort of spreadsheet, handwritten census, and just keep going until you found a B for Black or M for mulatto and write it down. So and I did this for 11 years for 2 different cities in order to to filter out the Black people. And then once I got that list, from year to year, I would do the persisters, like who's sticking around, who are the long standing residents. So the Latimers were definitely, really prominent in my mind. But when the last kind of primary research, I had more than I needed, but I wanted to do tax records. And I don't know, maybe a quarter of the way through what I started there, I just got exhausted. I needed to shut it down. But that would be really fascinating, would be to do a kind of history of those, those deeds, those pieces of land, and when they were acquired, how long they were held, how they passed from in and out of Black hands, I think would be really fascinating. So, I would think that if you're really interested in the land, that's a whole open area to look at. And the census will let you know, I still have the list of who the Black people were, but the census will let you know whether they owned or whether they were renting. And so you could take a list of that and just, from year to year, see what was happening. So I just want to encourage you, Terry. And then Terry, why are you back in Saratoga Springs? I have to ask that.
I was on my way to a bowling tournament with my family members in Rochester. So, I contacted Miss Martin in Moreau because the family owned a farm and / orchard, which is now the Candy Cane Farm. So Miss Martin there, the historian in Moreau, was nice enough to take me to the Candy Cane Farm and also some of the other properties there. So we got to see where they actually lived, and took pictures and went down to the Lake Champlain, or a lock at Lake Champlain, I guess it is, where supposedly they might have, near there they ran an underground railroad. I don't know if it's documented 100% or not, but it appears that they might have run an underground railroad from Moreau, and they would take the people down to the lock there, and they go up river to Canada. So, I got a lot of history, a lot of documents were provided to me. So I didn't want to just go to Rochester like I go every year to this bowling tournament. I wanted to just stop through Albany, Moreau, Saratoga, and then make the trip there. And it was quite the trip. I didn't make it to Albany the first day because it was so much to see in Moreau and Saratoga Springs. But on my way back to New York, I live in Queens, I stopped at Albany, went to the cemetery there, and I was kind of a little disappointed in the cemetery there, I gotta say, because the Black section of the cemetery where the Black churches moved there, when the city built the new government buildings, they closed up a park. I opened up a park. They moved some of the cemeteries of the Black churches to a one site there, and it really is not being kept up. I'll say that.
Huge area right there, folks.
It's true. Yeah. Well, thank you, Terry, so much for coming and sharing. And I was just we did a house history for what is now 17 or 15 Franklin Street, which is that big white Greek Revival house that's kitty corner from West Side Stadium Cafe by Sam's Tire. And you'll know it when you go by, you guys, the next time. But that house was built by David Franklin, who was listed as a mulatto in the city directory or in the census tract. And it looks like it was Washington Putnam who leased him the land, or paid the taxes on the land early on, even though David built the house. So we have a little bit of early history on that house, but it would be really interesting, as you were saying, Myra, to know about the deeds and the land of the more of Congress Street. And again, we have such amazing resources and partners in this community. Like I said, we have the Saratoga Springs History Museum with their amazing bolster collection. We have the Saratoga Room at the Saratoga Springs Public Library that has the city directories and the Sanborn maps. A lot of the Sanborn maps you can find online through the Library of Congress, actually. So you don't necessarily have to come to the library. You can look Sanborn maps up on the Library of Congress. There is the city directories, like I said, they have a reverse directory and starting in, I want to say in 1884, and it's by street address. So you can actually go to a section of the city directory and look up Congress Street and see the names of the people, and then flip to their names in the directory to see where they lived and what their business was. So there's that kind of research. We also have our city historian who's located in the visitor center, and she has all the archives from the Urban Renewal. When that, and I'm not going to think of the actual agency's name, the formal agency, but they have all of that documentation. So we're really lucky to have so many resources. And again, Erasing Spaces and Faces, they've been doing some of this work before we did this presentation tonight. So I certainly don't want to take away from them. I want to encourage that you follow them as well. And yes, we need to make sure we get Terry's contact information so we can keep him involved and hear more.
Samantha, who did you say had the Urban Renewal documents?
The city historian, which is located in the Saratoga Heritage Visitor Center.
Okay, thank you. Sorry.
No, I'm happy to share.
I also remember, weren't there some documents also that Skidmore had on renewal? I remember maybe they eventually gave them over to the city historian, but there were some there.
Okay. Well, again, we have a whole other, another wonderful education institution that we have here in our community. So with that said, I think we're going to wrap up tonight. We hope to have new programs or different programs. If you guys have suggestions, please feel free to reach out to us and share those suggestions with us. And I hope you all learned something tonight. I hope we all take away something. And we'll just keep up our work. And I thank Myra for your time and your research and your and for being a part of tonight's conversation.
Oh yeah, you're doing some exciting things. Don't be discouraged.
Yes, we are lucky to have so many people in the community that care. And so with that, I hope you all have a wonderful night, and we will see you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.